go ahead and have a quick 15 minutes or so for the time that we have remaining for some questions. So my name is Bob Sindelar. I've been working with PTC products for about 7 years now. In particular, I've been working mostly with PDM-Link and change and configuration management, as long as several of the modules within PDM-Link, particularly Project Link, PartsLink, and the SUMA module. I've been involved in pretty much every type of role within a project, from implementation consultant to solution architect all the way up through project manager. Just for everyone's reminder, today all the participants will be on mute for the duration of the call. So if you do have a question, please use the chat feature in the GoToMeeting area, and they will be addressed at the end of the demo. So let's get into some PartsLink conversation. So what is PartsLink? PartsLink is a seamlessly integrated module to PDM-Link that essentially allows you to take your WT parts and add an additional sort of an attribute to be able to actually classify the WT part. The best way to describe this attribute is a way to essentially have a set of changeable attributes to the part, not only in the actual value of what the attribute may be, but you can also have, for specific WT parts within a particular type, you can have different attribute types, like a color or a material, or as you'll see in my demonstration, for component types, you could have different attributes that apply to bolts than it would for nuts, for example. What's nice is that the attributes are specific to the classification of the object rather than the part. So you can very easily change which attributes remain available depending on that part's classification itself. What happens with this is, as you build the parts with classifications, you create a searchable catalog of items by attribute, and it becomes a much easier way to search for it rather than needing to know any sort of names or numbers with a smart or semi-smart numbering system. So the top benefits of using PartsLink include a faster and more human method of searching, because now you don't have to remember that a certain part number happens to have a certain set of attributes. You can just simply search on that attribute itself. And it's a bit more of a streamlined method of search than the out-of-the-box search pane on the left-hand side of the flyout. What you'll notice is that after using PartsLink for a period of time, there'll be a significant reduction in duplication of parts, because it'll be easier for the user community to find similar or identical pre-existing parts when going into new product development or trying to find additional parts to satisfy a particular item coming up. What's also nice about PartsLink is that it's much easier to add or change the attribution on the classification node rather than the part. For those of you familiar with the type and attribute manager, you would notice that whatever you apply to the specific type, that exists for all types. And you may have a broader form of typing on the WT parts. Here, that isn't required. You can just simply have a classification structure, and it's a much lighter weight type method to contain those attributes. So the first thing to take a look at, again at a high level, is creating a schema node. The schema is the collection of nodes within the classification structure that fully identify how you can classify a part. In Windchill 10.2 M30, the latest version currently out, there's something called a classification administrator, which is actually very similar to the type and attribute administrator in function and look. What you can do is, at the left side here, you'll notice there's a classification tree where you can create a set of classifications here. And this is a very simple example, but what we notice is that from the root, there's an overall part classification, and then there's one subclassification of hardware. Underneath it has several what we call leaf classifications, or like an end node of classification. If you click on a specific classification, you can actually see the attributes that are applied to that classification, as well as any properties or layouts, how it appears in the system. And in the attributes page, again, like the type and attribute manager, you can add any attributes that have been created in your system and further define them here in a very similar way. Now for the basics, just classifying a WT part. You can classify a WT part either by creating a new one or editing an existing WT part. It shows simply as an additional attribute, just like any other attribute would on the WT part. On the image on the left, we see at the very beginning, after picking the main part type, we don't have a classification yet, but if we click on the magnifying glass and select the classification, we'll see that there is another classification called nut selected here, and there will be another step in the wizard where you can set your classification attributes, which we'll show in the demo. Similarly to creating the classification, you can edit a classified WT part as well. It uses the same wizard as the standard edit wizard on the WT part. What you'll notice here is this editing of bolt 1. It has a bolt classification, and you see the classification attributes, what they currently exist at. You can actually change the classification entirely if you desire to do so by clicking the magnifying glass here and selecting through this drop-down for the classification tree. Or you can simply just update the classification attributes for that particular node as well. One point to note, it's also possible to give the WT part multiple classifications by having multiple of the attribute classification. So if there ever was a particular reason you wanted to identify something as a spacer and a washer here, you can actually do that on a specific part, and it will show up in the classification schema, the list of classified parts in both places. Searching for classified parts is probably the biggest benefit that you have with using Partslink. There's many different ways you can search for a classified part, and it depends on your intent. Pretty much all these ways that I'm going to show you today start from the same location. It's very easy to do for anyone that's very used to the standard keyword search in the browser. If you drop down the keyword search, you'll see at the bottom you also have now a classification search as well, which brings up an entirely different wizard in the system. Likely the most common way that you would be searching in Windchill is to browse to a leaf node. As we discussed before, a leaf node is a node at which you would more commonly identify your parts and no further designation of a type of part exists, and you would have most of your attributes at this leaf node. So what we see here is we've actually browsed to a node called bracket, and at bracket there are these attributes listed here. And depending on the type of attribute that exists, you'll see that there are different operators you may or may not be able to apply. For example, the bend angle attribute here is actually a number. So I can say if it equals an exact value, is greater than or less than a value, or is within a range. And what's also nice about this is in the search page, it'll show me of my classified items, what's the current range of my min and max of classified items and what unit am I working with. The bracket shape here is actually a string attribute, but it has a pick list of values, so I can use a drop down here to populate that. The lead-free attribute is actually a Boolean operator, so it'll have values of yes, no, or undefined. And then you'll see as well there's even a couple string values that are just free text fields as well. And it also includes name and number, and that's the WT part itself, the name and number. Another way you can search, if you're looking for a broader search, and depending on how your classification schema is set up, you can always go to a specific node that isn't a leaf node and just start the search from there. If you recall from the node structure I had shown earlier, underneath or above the bracket and bolt and washer and similar type nodes was one called hardware, which included all of those. You can do this for a broader type of search where an attribute is defined across many subnodes. And in this particular example, we have a lead-free and mass attributes that are applied on hardware. So not only can you search all hardware within the system, but you could also even, you could either search for on all objects that have it underneath hardware, or you could search individually on the classification nodes itself. And the last item we'll see today is finding similar parts. What's really nice in Classification Administrator and Partslink is that once you do create a search and you get a list of parts, there's a one-click button that allows the user to populate search field of the attributes and the values that that particular part had. In this example, it's a part called spacer 5. And from there, you can say, actually, I just want to say what's similar, just tick material here for stainless steel. Show me all of my spacers that are stainless steel, or all my entire parts that are stainless steel. And you can do that simply just by ticking the box you want of the values. You can even modify the search terms here. And for numerical values, you can search with an absolute range, plus or minus, or even a percentage range, plus or minus, of that particular value as well. So now we're going to go to the demo system here. Just give me a minute to switch machines. Alrighty. So here I am in my user desktop. I'm going to log in to my Windchill system. And a lot of the functions I'm showing you today, obviously they depend on your access control configuration for who you're allowing to do certain things. But for everything I'm showing in the demonstration today, any user with just basic type of member rights, when you look at the out-of-the-box ACL, should be able to do everything we're going to do here. With one exception, and that's the first thing we'll show, that's creating the schema node. So the way this works is that in Windchill, similar again to the type and attribute manager, if you pull out the left side flyout under Browse, you'll notice that there's a new icon called Classification Administration. And users that will have access to this will either be your site or organization admins, or anyone that you explicitly give access to a Classification Administrators group. If you click here, you'll see you can either put people in the group for further administration, or you can go to Manage Classifications, which will show the wizard here. Here we can see the classification structure that I've created, as well as go to any classification in the system and pull up information about that classification, and also pull up the attributes of that classification as well, and make modifications as necessary. If I wanted to here, I could pick any one of these classifications, and from them, insert a new node using the Insert Node wizard. So in this manner, over time, you would continue to flesh out your classification structure and make it more and more mature for all the different items that you would be building. So the next item I'd like to show is actually going through and creating a part and classifying it. I'm going to browse to my Common Components library. And in my library, I'm going to select New WT Part. Again, I can do all of this as a regular user, provided they have access to make parts. I will pick my part type. Here I just want the basic part. In my particular system, I could choose my own number and name. So I'm going to do that here. Call it Demo Workshop Part. I'll give the name the same thing. And again, you see all the same out-of-the-box type attributes here, but we also have this classification attribute. So if I click on Find, it will pull up another wizard where I can then drill down to whichever classification I want. One thing I want to point out here, any of these tick boxes here, these radio buttons, you'll only be able to select one for the classification. And currently in this configuration, I have any of these nodes selectable. You can configure the system to say, I only want to have leaf nodes configured. So you can say, if I don't want people to be able to classify something as part or hardware. And that's a very simple switch within the classification administrator itself. So let's say this object is going to be a bolt. Okay? So I select bolt, I hit OK. And what we'll notice is I now have a second step in my wizard. And I also can't click Finish right away because I got to address that second step. Okay? So in my second step, I can set my attributes as needed. So I'll do that here. Notice that I also have a pick list for my string one here. I have a head type. We'll fill that in. This thread count is actually a string, but I'm going to use a number here, which is fine. One thing to point out here, this takes the same information and restrictions as any attribute would in the system. So if I chose to do so, I could make mass a required attribute as well and have it have an asterisk here, or any of these attributes for that matter. So I'll go ahead and finish my creation there. And I'll go to my part, demo workshop part, and we'll see that I've created a bolt. There's the classification structure. It's a bolt, and all the attributes that I had put in here as well. Next thing I'd like to show is how to edit a classified part. So I'm going to go to a part that already exists that I didn't make in this demonstration. Let's go to a nut. And I can do any way that you would invoke the edit wizard is a way that you can invoke edit and classification. So for here, I'll just show it in the folder pane. We'll right click. We'll do checkout and edit. And just like any other operation that would modify a part, this will raise the iteration of the object as well. So here, I could actually say, maybe I want to keep this a nut, which I'll do in this example. But I want to change some of the attributes. Note that I have a completely different set, well, not completely different, but I have a different set of attributes for a nut than I did for a bolt. Some apply because they were applied on the hardware node, like this lead-free and mass. But I also have a nut shape here. Maybe this isn't a star nut, but it's actually a square nut instead, and that was a mistake. Okay, we'll put that in. We'll make that the change. I can use save and keep the object checked out like normal, or I can kind of do the shortcut here. One step, save and check in. Put in my check-in comments. And there we go. I've made my update to the nut. If it's right here, nut 4. And now we see that it's a square. And finally, let's go ahead and get into the search function within Windchill. So we'll drop down. We'll do a classification search. And here what we see is this is the browsing sort of catalog type configuration of Windchill, particularly Partslink. What I can do here is browse to any node I want within the structure going down. I have a relatively simple structure here. So what you'll see is you start at the base part. I can either go one level down to hardware, or you can also go 2 levels down from wherever you are. The number that is next to the node specifies the quantity of objects that are classified at that node. So I can go to hardware, and I can see under the hardware node all the different nodes I have listed here. These images are also custom images that you can load for each node as well. So if you have specific images custom to your particular company, they can be applied here. I'm going to pull out the bolt node here. And what's kind of useful about this is instead of showing me every single match because I haven't specified the nodes yet, it just tells me right now all of my bolts have matched. If I want to see them all in a browse function, I can do so here. See, I can see all the bolts here, and I even see the one I just classified in this demo, which is nice. What I can also do here is further specify either multiple or even just a single attribute. For example, let's say I want to see all my bolts that are of a T head type. So I can select T head type from the drop-down. As you see, it populates a value there. And if I do search, what it will do is if there's a small enough subset of objects, it will just show me in a drop in the window here, 20 objects have matched. So I can see from here, these are all the objects that have a head type of T. From here, we can even say, you know what, why don't I want, for bolt 60, I want to see similar parts. So if I click on that search for similar parts, now I see a very similar search page, but I'm trying to find matches similar to bolt 60. And what you'll notice here is right now, there isn't any exact matches. And that makes sense because the name and number are also identified here. All I want to do is select which of these objects I want to identify for my classification search. Maybe I noticed I want to keep this thread type the same. Okay, so we'll search for bolts that have that thread type. And there we go. Now I have a completely different set of search results that may or may not be a head type T, but all I cared about was that my thread type was UNF3B. And there they are. The last item to really show in this search page here is, well, for one thing, like other search pages, I can just click on any one of these eye icons to go straight to that part. And the last item I want to do a search on, or to show, is to do a search where if I go to classification search, and then I browse to hardware, in this particular system, I actually do have attributes applied to hardware. So if I want, rather than drilling down to these individual nodes, I can just perform a search right here at the hardware node. And the attributes that apply in hardware are, of course, name and number, but I also have a lead-free, mass, and material. So let's say all I want to do is look in mass and do a range of objects. Let's say I want to range between 200 and 400 grams. This will search the entire classification structure underneath hardware that satisfies that criteria. So you notice I do a search. I didn't see anything come up. Well, not quite. I did have exact matches. There's just several of them, so the system didn't show them to me. If I want, I can hit the View All button and see the system right there. And we'll see there's several washers that have matched. There's also spacers that have matched, screws, nuts, all of these at different classification nodes underneath the hardware node. So I'm going to switch back the presenter back to my main machine here. And I just have one more slide here I wanted to bring up. Just some final thoughts. Windchill change and configuration management is highly recommended before implementing Partslink for optimal use. This is because with more configuration options, you obviously have more ability to make changes within Windchill, and you want to still keep that revision controlled and tracked adequately in case there's a need to change a classification or change objects. Eccellent has a lot of experience and expertise in Partslink implementation, which also includes not only the creation of the schema and parts, but the ability to do them en masse. Many systems I've seen have classification schemas that can easily get up to 1,000, 1,500 nodes, and obviously within several systems there are thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of WT parts that may need classification. So I'm going to take some time here to go through some of the chat questions in the log. One question posted here, is there an additional cost for Partslink? The answer is yes. There is a licensing cost from PTC to purchase Partslink. Please check with your PTC sales representative to inquire about what the cost would be based upon, it's based upon the same types of things, I believe, as regular PDM link licensing. So you can check with your PTC providers as similar. Some of the other questions in here, just kind of a general comment based on some of the questions. For the WT parts here, what I've been showing is kind of some component objects here, but this classification structure can apply not only to lower level component items, but anything in your system that can be a WT part. This can include even a very large top-level assembly. For example, an airplane manufacturer who classifies a plane as a top-level assembly could have hundreds of thousands of parts in it. but that plain WT part can also be classified and have its share of attributes too. Maybe you want to have the wingspan size or the overall weight of the plane as well. Just a reminder to everyone as well, we will make this presentation available on our website on www.eccellent.com, and we're also recording this meeting as well. And there will also be some separate videos that will be there as well, showing similar demonstration to what I provided here. Still looking at some of the other questions, you can also apply Partslink attribution to subtypes of WT parts as well. What you would accomplish here is if you have particular parts that you do want to classify, but you also have specific parts that you want to avoid the whole classification schema concept, you do have the ability to do that as well. If you had noticed in the classification administrator, my base classification was just called part. You can actually have a different base type applied to that classification, or even have potentially different nodes to different types as well. Obviously, it adds a little bit to the complexity of the classification structure, but it is an option that you have to do. Does Partslink map any attributes to the associated CAD model as parameters? So that may be something I'll have to take offline and we can look at and confirm. But as far as the makeup is concerned, if the attribute exists in Windchill and can be mapped to a parameter, there may be a way to also apply that attribute through the Partslink method of attribution to the classification as opposed to the standard type and attribute. Just some last comments too regarding the updates in 10.2 versus 9.1. Partslink has come a long way in 10.2, at least in my personal experience. My first experience with Partslink was back in the 9.0 days, where there was actually a separate program that you would run called a Counterpart. And Counterpart worked with a project file of sorts that you would use as the mechanism to import and export classifications. So there were some issues with that import-export functionality as opposed to being integrated into PDM-Link with an actual classification administrator itself. And in my personal experience, I believe that this is a very, very welcome addition and modification to the 10.2 environment. And finally, you could use this classification node as part of a way in your system to build it into your workflows, change management. What I would highly recommend is that the classification node itself can be listed as a required attribute on the object. So anytime you would create a part, you'd have to give it a classification. Now obviously there's the human component of is that classification correct? And the system can't really tell you that, right? You've got to be able to identify what's correct and build a workflow structure around it to modify that. But because the classification itself also functions as an attribute on the part, it follows those same restrictions as well. So it looks like we got about through the questions on the chat here. I'll leave the meeting room open for a couple more minutes for a few last-minute chat questions, but otherwise, we've come to the end of the demo and the workshop. Everyone have a great day.